Hello there, this is Lin and welcome back to the channel. I'm sorry I haven't uploaded much other than the new podcast I'm doing. I promise this will be the beginning of a return to regularly scheduled programming. Also check out my podcast if you have a chance. It's a podcast where I make my friends watch movies either I love or love to hate that they're not familiar with and talk about it with them. For the first few episodes, we're going through the entire Fast and Furious franchise. So check that out if you want to laugh. It should be in the channel. Alright, let's talk about Loki. We're going to have spoilers for episode 1 and 2. I'm mainly going to be covering the TVA, the Sacred Timeline, Lady Loki, and the Timekeepers. But because this is my first video on Loki, I'm also going to be starting with a brief review of the series. There'll be time codes in the description. Alright, let's get started. So far, I'm loving this series. I know it's, big surprise coming from a big Marvel fan. But if the Disney Plus shows are going to be character studies of the individual characters, especially smaller characters, which doesn't get main screen bailing, I'm all for it. That's exactly what I want from these shows. I mean, Loki is a pretty major character, but he doesn't get to be the core point of any movies. But now we're having 6 whole hours dedicated to studying his character, just like WandaVision did for Wanda, and just like Falcon and the Winter Soldier did for Falcon, Winter Soldier, and John Walker. If you want some more content on those shows, check out my old videos as well. And as far as character studies for Loki go, I was a little bit skeptical of this show in the beginning because in a lot of way this show is going to have to reset a lot of Loki's character development because this is the Loki from end of Avengers 1. But I really like what they did there. It's a little bit of cheating in screenwriting because they literally just show him his character development from the other movies this particular version of Loki haven't gone through. But the more I think about it, the reason it worked is because they already did the legwork in Thor Ragnarok and Infinity War. And even the Thor movie everybody hated, Thor the Dark World, has been retroactively given a lot more emotional weight in this show. So that scene where he sit through what happens to him in his future, it's one of my favorite scenes in the show so far. Obviously, great acting by Tom Hiddleston, but also it just give a lot of weight to things that they couldn't do it the first time around. The main thing that jumped out at me that Thor the Dark World and the other movies failed to address is Loki's mom's death is his fault. They straight up say in this, Owen Wilson's character Mobius just throw it in his face. It's his fault. He guided the Dark Elves hoping it would bring harm to Thor. And in the end, it just achieved in killing what seems to be the only person he truly loved and the only person who has always been squarely in his corner, his mom. So that scene packed a lot of emotional weight. And even though it is really like it's Ghost of Christmas Future for Loki, I think it works. It doesn't magically transform this character into the character that sacrificed himself at the beginning of Infinity War, but it goes a long way to give this character more nuance than just the guy who failed his invasion of Earth. And a lot of this show is working for me because of the back and forth between Owen Wilson and Loki. Loki thrives on thinking he's the smartest person in the room and thinking he's always in the control of a conversation. That's why, he's scared of Hulk. Hulk is the one Avengers he can't verbally manipulate. But this back and forth between Mobius, Owen Wilson's character, in which we're not sure who's in control. It goes back and forth. In certain situations, clearly Mobius has the complete upper hand, but there are also moments in which Loki breaks through his control and wrestle control of the conversation of the situation away from him for a little bit. That little back and forth is so good, so much so that when they are split up at the end of episode 2, I hope it's not for long. I hope those two characters get to bounce off each other a lot more for the rest of the show because it's been great. Alright, now let's talk about the TVA and the sacred timeline. The main reason I'm making this video is a lot of people seem to be confused about the TVA and its functions. And as a result, it's leading to a lot of weird questions and mass confusion about potential plot hole and such in the fan cycles that I frequent in. Well, see, I think the main confusion comes from people assuming, even before the show come out, that the TVAs are time cops. Now it's been made abundantly clear. They're not time cops. They're timeline cops. So what's the difference? Well, people are assuming that they're here to stop time travelers. And that confusion is being compounded by the main villain, Lady Loki, or whoever she is using time travel to wreak havoc. But that's not business as usual for them. That's not the main crime they handle. This is not my take, by the way. This is all supported by the show. You go back and definitely rewatch, if not all the episodes, just the animated part where Miss Minute explained the TVA's function, and it's all laid out in there. So basically, they just guard a timeline that they call the sacred timeline. Anytime anybody veer off from that, they are there to fix it. Worst case scenario, they're there to use those charges to disintegrate people in a way that reset the timeline. I mean, time travel would cause that kind of variance, but mainly anything can do it. They say even a person being late to work, like people deciding to do things differently from how they think the sacred timeline should go, that mark that person as a variant, and the TVA get involved. So in reality, they actually cops against freedom. They curtail free will. People of the universe only have free will as far as in the range that TVA allows it. Any decision outside that would create a variant timeline, the TVA is there to stop it. So they're after Loki, not because he time traveled. This Loki never time traveled. He used the Space Stone to go to Mongolia. He didn't travel in time, he just teleported. The Space Stone does not allow people to travel in time, and Loki never demonstrated any inherent power to travel in time. And in the show, they didn't use a timestamp to show that he went to a different time, he just teleported. The reason they after him, because he escaped, and he's not supposed to escape. And the reason they not after the Avengers for traveling in time, because they decided that's part of the sacred timeline. The timeline of all the movies we've seen is the sacred timeline. Like, if you accept that, then it's everything clicked together, right? Pretty much most of your questions asking why didn't they do this, why didn't they do that, can be just answered with they consider it part of the sacred timeline. So if you really think about it, the TVAs cannot be good guys, right? Even look at the way that Trooper act in episode 2 to the people who are seeking shelter from the storm. Do the grunts either human life doesn't matter anymore, or they're so out of touch with reality and with everyday life that they don't even know what fish is. And even a top level analyst like Mobius, he's clearly is not a true believer. He's holding on to the idea of jet skis. Like, he wants to remember what's worth saving, and to him that's jet skis. I mean, it's a joke, but it's also like quite poignant way to look at how these people are bureaucratic enforcers of what they think is sacred. They're the Time Vatican. They're a religious cult with time travel powers. So that's why Loki's discussion with Mobius about free will is very important, because if you remember, just a few days ago, Loki was giving a speech about how freedom is an illusion and you can only be at peace when you live without freedom of choice. To the people in Germany, to Nick Fury, this Loki just came off the events in Avengers. So he met a bigger fish who decided that people, including people like him, are more at peace in this one sacred timeline when they don't have freedom of choice, when they only have a small range of choice in which they're protected from the madness of the multiverse. Well, that's Loki's shtick writ large. So now Loki is really kind of fighting himself with more unlimited power. More on that later. So what we also need to know about the sacred timeline, it's bullshit, right? It's just a main timeline or a timeline. We don't even know what makes this special that the Timekeepers say is the sacred prime timeline. And script writing, right, is brilliant because it gives them a complete out of the slight convolution they left at the end of Endgame. Because now they can just say, oh, everything that's happening is the sacred timeline as being enforced by the TVA. But I don't feel that it's cheap. Well, I guess it depends on how this show concludes. If it concludes with the sacred timeline being maintained, I would feel that quite cheap. But I think the way this show is going is the multiverse is going to get restored by the end of it, right? Because, I mean, the next show is What If. It's about different what if scenarios in the vast multiverse. And we're also having a movie called Multiverse of Madness coming. So there is no way the sacred timeline maintained. Even if the ending of episode 2 doesn't directly result in the multiverse coming back straight away, by the end of this show, I'm pretty sure we're going to get the multiverse back. And I like it because it also sidesteps what I hate in multiversal storytelling, including like the DC Marvel multiverse, in that there is always a prime timeline, which doesn't make sense. If it is a truly infinite multiverse, why would one of those timelines be more important than the other? But they always have to put weight on the timeline we follow as the readers or the viewers and say this is the prime timeline. Well, with this, so this timeline, the timeline we follow, is already justified in the text by saying, oh, it's just that the TVA decided that this is the sacred timeline. But, like I said, it's bullshit, because what Loki does is not a crime. Not really. It's not a crime against the timeline. I mean, everything he did in Avengers is a crime. He's a villain, don't get me wrong. But him picking up the space stone and escaping, that's just natural. Because even in the real world, there are certain Scandinavian countries who says it is a human right to want to be free. And for people who escape from prison, when they catch them, they don't add to their sentence for trying to escape or successfully escaping. They just have to serve out the rest of their sentence that they escaped from, because they say it is within the nature of human to try to escape from captivity. That in itself is not a crime. I mean, as long as they didn't hurt people on the way to escaping, those will be separate crimes. But that sidetrack aside, the sacred timeline is bullshit. They're trying to enforce it against people's free will. Can you imagine being late to work, and because it affects some unknown massive event unbeknownst to you, suddenly time cops showing up and either threatening you, resetting you, or deleting you? They straight up bureaucratic nut jobs. They deleted that guy because he didn't have a slip on him, and he says he never got one. So I don't think we should consider the TVA good guys. Like, I think certain people of the TVAs are good guys. I think Mobius seemed to be on the up and up. Maybe even that judge that he seemed to have a flirty relationship with. But everybody else, I don't know. They seem to be like stormtroopers of some unknown entities that they worship. So that being said, I want to address some common questions that people are asking, right? Well, I've brought it up before a little bit. Why are the Avengers allowed to time travel? It's part of the sacred timeline. They can go back and do these things because the timeline in which they do that and defeat Thanos and how Endgame end, that's how it's supposed to happen according to the TVA. What about the little things they change in timeline? Well, this just shows to prove that Cap's mission back works. None of these will diverge into a variant timeline if Cap successfully put those things back exactly where they stole it from. So I don't know how he succeeded in Vormir. Did he just throw it off a pit? But until otherwise shown, we can just assume that Cap's mission worked exactly as intended, and therefore it is not a crime against the sacred timeline. What about Cap going back and living out his life with Peggy? Surely that will create a separate timeline, right? Well, not necessarily, because the way the sacred timeline, according to the TVA, operate right now is they are a range of choices. As long as nothing branch off in a major way, they seem to not care or not bother. They don't seem to be following that very strict butterfly theory idea of time travel where every single little things have divergent, massive repercussion. They seem to think the timeline almost always like heal itself and maintain the course unless massive things happen. So there's two ways we can take this. Maybe Cap is just very good at living out his life very uneventfully after going back and marrying Peggy. And that is the easiest answer. And alternatively, maybe they did create a variant timeline and they got pruned. People are saying there's an Easter egg of Peggy in the TVA. I don't think so. I think it's just similar costuming. But whether or not it's true, the TVA could have simply trimmed that timeline. But you say, well, what about Old Man Cap coming back in the end? Well, it depends on how this show ends. Maybe at the end of this show, the multiverse come back and Cap get to live out his life in a variant divergent timeline, and then travel back to the timeline of the endgame and give the shield to Falcon. I know it's a little bit confusing because time travel is involved, but resetting the multiverse in the future just means that everything is restored, and if Cap and Peggy didn't know that reality was pruned, it would just continue as scheduled. But I think more likely, unless other evidence presents itself, we can just assume Cap was just very good at living his life uneventfully for the rest of his years. So let's talk about Lady Loki, or whoever she is. I think all things point to her being primarily Lady Loki, but maybe a little bit more. Well, let me clarify, right? The show is acting as if this is a version of Loki. They say they're hunting for a version of Loki, and then when they find her, she does seem to suggest that she's Loki. When Loki says, "So you're me," her line says, "If anything, you're me." If she's not Loki, she's at least wanting Loki to think she is. But she also have other lines like, don't call me by that name. And then she says, "Call me Randy," which was a joke because that was the guy she was enchanting at the time. But here's where it started to get a little bit more complex, which is in the international credits, her character is credited as Sylvie. Sylvie Lushton is a name of a different version of Enchantress, not the main version of Enchantress, which is Amora, which has showed up in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. before. Sylvie Lushton is somebody who Loki actually created to make her think she's an Asgardian, but she's not. She's a person with powers. But here's another layer, right? In the show, when Loki is in the TVA file room going through the Ragnarok file, one of the files says Sylvie Laufey Dottir on it. So Loki is usually known as Loki Odinson, right? Because everybody thinks he's son of Odin and he's adopted by Odin. But really, TVA calls him Loki Laufey's son because he's actually the son of the ice giant king Laufey. Well, Laufey Dottir means daughter of Laufey. I guess potentially she could be Loki's sister, but the TVA seems to think she is a variant of Loki. I don't know why she's choosing to go by Sylvie. And there is also a moment where Loki says about her powers, nice enchantments. So yeah, some people are saying, she's Sylvie Lushton Enchantress. Some people are saying she's Loki. Well, the show seems to be planting seeds for both. So it could go either way, but I think the more Occam's razor, the easiest thing is they just combining the characters. She's both. She's Lady Loki named Sylvie. But they will also maybe probably call her Enchantress at some point. So who is she? What is her plot? Well, I think she is a survivor of that multiverse war they mentioned at the very beginning of the show. That massive multiverse war that supposedly the Timekeepers won and resulted in the sacred timeline. I think this is her revenge because her whole universe in the multiverse got trimmed by the TVA. And now she is there to either restore it or just create chaos and mischief for the TVA. She seemed to be in particular after the Timekeepers. Maybe there is more of a personal reason for it. What I'm hinting at is we could be already looking at a TVA that is already being controlled by a version of Loki. Like the classic sniveling, worm-turned version of old Loki, God King Loki, which somehow either won the multiverse war or after the multiverse war is won and the TVA is set up, wormed his way into being in charge of the TVA and is now dictating how it's run. Because, well, they did say the Timekeepers are taking particular interest in this case, which I find it very suspicious. Look, I know it's a long shot, Loki being behind the thing, but thematically, the way that the TVA is acting, the way the TVA is being run, I think it kind of fit. But at the very least, I'm 100% sure that the TVA is not a good guy in this story. And I'm not saying Sylvie Lady Loki is either. I'm just saying there's more to it. There's also a chance that the Timekeepers are up and up, and the reason they are enforcing these very strict, very ruthless sacred timeline is because they are trying to stop the restoration of the multiverse to prevent Kang from returning. Kang the Conqueror, we know, is coming in Ant-Man Quantumania, and rumored to be a major villain for Phase 4 and maybe even beyond. And if you know Kang's story, he's like a multiversal time-traveling conqueror, and he has an army of himself that he has plucked from different multiverses. Maybe the multiverse has been reduced to a single one to stop Kang from amassing an army of his own self. So that's all from me for now. I'm loving this show and I plan to create more content on it. So if you like this video, leave me a like, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you think of my theories. Let me know about what you think about the TVA. Are they the good guys? Let me know what you think about Lady Loki. Anyway, peace.